Good evening and welcome to Columbia Law School. My name is Michael Gerard. I'm on the faculty here and I am director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, which has the honor of co-sponsoring this evening's program with the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment and with the Environmental Law Society. We're very pleased that you're joining us for this program about trade, investment, and climate change under the Trump administration. And I want to start by thanking Lisa Johnson and Michael Berger for doing the lion's share of the work in organizing this program. Donald Trump came to office promising a fundamental shift in trade policy, which included exiting from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the North American Free Trade Agreement. He's done the first, and speculation has begun regarding what he intends to do with the latter. He's indicated the possibility of new trade agreements, including with the United Kingdom, a country which has experienced its own political upheaval and electoral shocks in the past year. In this context, many are wondering what the implications would be for national and international action on environmental issues, including most prominently climate change. Past U.S. trade agreements, such as NAFTA, had contained language seeking to prevent the treaty from generating a race to the bottom in terms of environmental protection. And some environmental groups thought that the draft provisions of the Trans-Pacific Partnership made important contributions to tackling international environmental challenges. But there were also many critiques of the agreements on the grounds that the environmental protections were too weak, that the agreements could be used to support and lock in unsustainable practices, and tellingly that the Trans-Pacific Partnership made no mention of climate change. A reset on trade policy offers an opportunity to take stock of trade and investment treaties' impacts on mitigation and adaptation, and to both shape new treaties and renegotiate existing ones so as to contribute to, or at least not to undermine, action on climate change. But we may also see a continuation of the status quo in terms of the trade investment treaties' treatment of environmental issues, or worse, a narrowing of environmental safeguards and commitments. Indeed, a more concerted effort to use trade and investment treaties as a tool for addressing climate change may seem particularly unlikely under President Trump. Although it's not clear what he actually thinks about climate change, his appointments of climate deniers to head the EPA and the Department of Energy and some other agencies, and other actions and statements, not the least of them being the famous climate change is a Chinese hoax tweets, do not fill one with optimism. A disconnect between trade and investment treaties on the one hand and climate change policies on the other has potential implications for U.S. climate policy, but also for trade, as countries such as France have floated the idea of imposing a carbon tax on U.S. goods if the U.S. pulls out of the Paris Agreement. The area is very much in flux. We've convened this panel to shed some light on what may or may not happen. We've assembled a very distinguished panel of experts this evening. I'll introduce each panelist before he or she speaks. They'll each talk for about 10 minutes. Then we'll have some discussion among ourselves, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. We'll adjourn at 8:30. Meanwhile, now would be a good time to make sure your mobile phones are off or silent. And I also want to tell you that this session is being tape recorded, and the tape will be posted on the websites of the two co-sponsoring organizations. So our first speaker this evening is Sylvia Masunis. She's a senior research fellow with the Center for International Governance Innovation's International Law Research Program. At the center, she contributes to a series of papers addressing how climate change protection measures are affecting the international legal framework within which the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change operates. The observations drawn from these papers will be the basis for a special report that will explore avenues to make the broader legal framework supportive of climate change protection measures and to develop policy options. Ms. Masunis was previously the Deputy Director of the Oceans and Environmental Law at Global Affairs Canada, and was the sole proprietor of a law firm and a consultant on international environmental law. She's held a number of positions within Global Affairs Canada. So please join me in welcoming Sylvia Misunis.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be in New York, though I must admit, coming across the border after you brought in your new president, I was a little hesitant. They didn't ask me a lot of questions, though, even though I didn't have a green card or any sort of visa and was just traveling on my passport. So we're all, I think, a little bit wary watching what's happening in the U.S. these days, not only on environmental issues and climate, but more broadly. So I currently work for the Centre for International Governance Innovation. That's a think tank in Waterloo, Ontario, in Canada. We're trying to look at a lot of emerging governance issues, how the international regime should respond to some of the contemporary problems of the day. And I'm working with the International Legal Research Programs there. And I just was promoted to be Deputy Director 4 days ago. So, hey, things are moving. Things are moving along. My experience has been largely when I was working in Global Affairs Canada with multilateral environmental agreements. So I'm going to start off my discussion today by just canvassing the issue of how trade and multilateral environmental agreements, which I will call MEAs, have interacted over the years. Trade and environment at the international level are no strangers to each other. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is the MEAs and trade provisions in them. I'll talk briefly about the climate regime and the trade provisions found in those legal instruments. Then we'll go to the most recent agreement. I think everybody has heard about the Paris Agreement, which was concluded in 2015 and just entered into force in November of 2016. We're going to talk briefly about the Canadian approach to the Paris Agreement. We'll also briefly talk about NAFTA and NACE and prospects for climate-friendly renegotiation, which I think are probably low. I'll give you that hint right now. And investment law challenges, and challenges basically that I am seeing and that I think other speakers will talk to in more detail later in this program. So, MEAs and trade. They've been around for a long time. Perhaps one of the first international agreements dealing with environment and trade was the CITES Agreement, which had rules governing trade in endangered species. You essentially could not, that's the fifth one down the line, you essentially could not, under CITES, trade in certain species unless you were trading with a party, and there were 3 levels of applicable trade, some that was restricted, others there was no commercial trade allowed, and then parties also had options of having more restrictive measures themselves. The Montreal Protocol is one that you've probably all heard about. Montreal Protocol governs ozone-depleting substances, and in the MEA world it's considered a resounding success because, in fact, the ozone layer is being restored, is restoring itself due to the actions of the parties who inadvertently, though, created an additional climate change problem. But the reason I'm talking about the Montreal Protocol is because they've got measures that control trade in the controlled substances like CFCs and HCFCs between parties and non-parties. So trade was part of the Montreal Protocol. Trade is part of the Stockholm Declaration, Stockholm Convention, which the U.S. is not party to, but it actually deals with restrictions on imports and exports of persistent organic pollutants, which are listed under that convention. Trade is also a factor in the Mercury Convention, Minamata Convention on Mercury, which the U.S. has ratified, and it deals with restrictions on trade in mercury. The Rio Declaration, you may have heard of the Rio Declaration. It was a declaration on environment and development, and was one of the seeds for the concept of sustainable development. In the Rio Declaration, there were provisions that dealt with trade, and basically the Principle 12 said that we should deal with global environmental problems as far as possible based on international consensus and in a way that doesn't impact on trade. So there was this happy coordination of measures between trade and environment. You also see that in the Basel Convention, which deals with transboundary movement of hazardous waste, and the Rotterdam Convention on Prior Informed Consent. So, climate regime. Climate regime is basically the umbrella agreement, the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, which you've all heard about, which dealt with restrictions largely on developed countries with respect to emissions limitations, and the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement has no references in it to preserving the trade system, and it is very general in nature. So what is the Paris Agreement? It entails legally binding obligations, the preparation of nationally determined contributions, which are essentially domestic climate plans. It's that each party shall prepare, communicate, and maintain successive nationally determined contributions. Note, it does not say that you have to implement or achieve. It only intends to achieve. Reporting, each party to provide a national inventory report of emissions by sources and sinks and information necessary to achieving its NDCs under Article 4. But the NDCs are outside the agreement. That allows for flexibility, but it's not legally required that laws and regulations be developed domestically, even though that will probably happen. Aims under the Paris Agreement, holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5. That's the one everybody knows about. That's the one that is guiding a lot of climate action. But also we have aims with respect to financial flows consistent with pathways to low greenhouse gas emissions. And also, most importantly, Article 4.1, the aim there of trying to achieve a balance of emissions and by sources and removals by sinks in the second half of the century. So we're supposed to be net carbon neutral by the second half of the century. So what did Canada do? We have a pan-Canadian framework, which is a federal government approach building on initiatives of provinces and territories. It has a carbon tax starting at $10 per ton, going up to $50 in 5 years, and it allows equivalence for cap and trade, and we have some provinces that are working with California on that, and also has some regulatory measures. We also have a midterm strategy which looks at ways to reduce 80% from 2005 by 2050. That is a big reduction, and it's coming soon. Possible U.S. positions on Paris? Well, you've got an NDC that was put down, 26 to 28% below 2005 by 2025. Again, short time period, 9 years. Is the U.S. going to stay in the Paris Agreement? It's not clear. It was Donald Trump was talking about withdrawing. That has gone down. He had an option of withdrawing from the Paris Agreement 4 years, withdrawing from the convention in 1, of simply ignoring the NDC, possibly not providing financing and contributions as required under the Paris Agreement, simply taking a very contrarian position in the meetings. There are limited compliance options for the COP. So that brings us to, maybe we need to look at this from a trade perspective and see what trade can do on this. So some of the issues that I see that might impact trade and climate are subsidies, fossil fuels, where there are a few challenges to subsidies, versus renewable energies, where there are many, like products, the restrictions on reflecting the carbon footprint of production in goods, border tax adjustments, which is something that Canada has been talking about, other states have been talking about as well. It's an option to prevent leakages. When goods come across the border, you put in a tax that takes into account the carbon footprint. and tariff issues, environmental goods negotiations, tariffs as incentives. So those are some issues. From the point of view of investment agreements, I would say that the investment agreements have been subject to some controversy because of the nature of the decision makers, who are basically trade lawyers, unsubstantiated claims by corporations. But others say that investment is good. We need investment for economic growth. In Canada, there was a decision on bill called Bill Con, which basically went against a decision made by an environmental assessment panel with respect to whether or not compensation was owing for a certain investment. So that caused a lot of concern in Canada about the nature of investment agreements. I just say a few more words on that. One issue that one might look at in terms of the investment issue is fossil fuel subsidies, and if you tried to pull them back, which would be a reasonable position to take given the obligations under the Paris Agreement, would you run into any problems from trade law or investment law? I will go over that. I'm just going to go back to the NAFTA. Just when I was looking at the materials on NAFTA to assess whether it was effective or not effective, the academic literature I saw basically said, you know, it increased trade. It's not clear whether how much the trade would have increased anyway, with or without it, at least for Canada. When they did NAFTA, because of civil society, there was also a NACE, a North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, which contains obligations to effectively enforce environmental law and not to derogate to attract investment. I think the consensus on the NACE is that it did not live up to expectations, but it did lead to some institutional cooperation. We all know the U.S. perspective, you know, that trade has caused job losses, there's deficits in trade, that maybe there's a desire for buy American. But with respect to Canada, the U.S. has said tweaks only. I'm not sure you can do tweaks only, but certainly those tweaks are not going to be to increase environmental protections or climate protections. From the Canadian perspective, I think there's an apprehension about what to expect from this administration, so I think the objective will be to minimize disruption to trade flows and maintain as positive a relationship as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dalanjebo Shabalala. He's a visiting assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Professor Shabalala's research focuses on the interaction of intellectual property law, especially patent law, with the rights of Indigenous peoples and climate change law. He conducts research on the rights of Indigenous people and traditional communities to their traditional knowledge and culture, and the role of international IP treaties in enabling or preventing the realization of these rights. He also conducts research on the interaction of patent law with climate change, focusing on the role of technology licensing and transfer in enabling the technology goals of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. His most recent book is Climate Change, Technology Transfer and Intellectual Property, Options for Action at the UNFCCC.
Thank you, Michael, and to Lisa for the invitation. It's always difficult trying to figure out just where to pitch this talk, because among law nerds, IP nerds are like the nerdiest you can find, and we tend to speak in obscure, monkish language about the area in which we work. So if I'm too obvious for some of you, I apologize, but I want to make the presentation as clear as possible. As Michael noted, I work on climate change technology issues at the intersection with intellectual property, and have done so for the past 10 years or so. I came to it because I'd been working on trade, on intellectual property and trade, in particular the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property, the TRIPS agreement, and its effect on developing countries related to access to medicines on one hand and access to knowledge on the other. And it turned out that that was both an expertise that was necessary at the time, but also translatable to multiple areas, in particular looking at climate change. So right now I work with a group of NGOs, the Climate Action Network International, coordinating the technology working group and the implementation of technology obligations within that framework in the UNFCCC, and have consistently over that period been talking with and providing advice to developing countries about how they should approach that. So those are my, I suppose, biases to start off with. But one of the things that we need to think about when we talk about climate change, right, is that there are essentially two key responses. We can change the amount we consume that produces greenhouse gas emissions either by refraining from consumption or by consuming in a much more greenhouse gas intensive way, in much less greenhouse gas intensive way, or in a much more energy efficient way. Those latter require technology. Right? In order to not have to change our behavior, that requires technologies to do, right? This is fuel efficient cars, this is solar panel lighting, this is fuel efficient airplanes, this is better building sheaths that are more heat efficient, right? It covers a whole range, right? Not just from energy production, but also energy consumption, right? So if you don't address technology, it's very difficult to figure out how you're going to address the climate change challenge. And so the ways in which you manage technology markets is crucial. And those technology markets are bifurcated. Right? The technology market is both at the level of the knowledge in the technology, right? And here we're talking about the patents, the copyrights, the trade secrets, right? And there's a trade in that. It involves licensing across borders, involves intellectual property protection. So that's crucial, and that's a system that we know and rely on for the generation of new technologies, and has, many of us believe, been relatively effective at that. The other side is that, right, there's a trade in technological products, right, the actual things. So the phone, right, the iPad, the car, getting that from one country to another country and to be adopted, right? And so all those technologies that are green technologies and the green products, we want those moving across borders as quickly as possible, right, and as fast as possible, and to be adopted as quickly as possible by firms and consumers in all the countries that are greenhouse gas producers. And so that, by definition, implicates trade, right? The trade in these technologies, in the technological goods and in the knowledge, right? So what's the problem then? This seems, right, you can just simply let the market address the problem, right? There is a demand for these technologies in country A, they are produced in country B, right? They should be able to then just move from country B. But the problem is, of course, is that the trade regime is a mix of things. It's a tariff regime where there may be higher or lower tariffs depending on the country that governs the imports and the export of a particular technology. There may be subsidies that relate to a particular technology that both encourages its production and then encourage its export, right? All those are things that are governed by the rules of trade organizations, in particular the World Trade Organization and the GATT, right? That trading in goods is governed. And so the question we have to think about and address is, to what extent, then, does that system limit the trade in these goods? Same thing with intellectual property, right? It's considered that necessary to have that protection in order to encourage people to invest or to send technological goods into your economy. Right? And again, the question is, to what extent does the WTO system and the TRIPS prevent free flow of those technologies and that information, right? To what extent does patent protection itself pose a barrier to the flow of technologies, both the goods and the knowledge? So this is the challenge at the UNFCCC that we have to deal with. And at UNFCCC in particular, it's governed by a particular structure, which is that developed countries have committed that in order to support action by developing countries, they will get money to support their actions, and they will get technology to support their actions, right? Which sounds like a gift, right? And of course, part of this revolves around this concept that there is historical responsibility on the part of the developed countries for emissions, and so in order to convince developing countries to take part in the process and to sacrifice particular growth pathways that are GHG emissions intensive, we have to provide them with finance and technology. So you can imagine what that looks like to the Trump administration, right? Giving technology and funding to developing countries. And when I say developing countries, I mean China, right? So you can imagine what the Trump administration thinks about China in the framework of this relationship between trade and climate change. So I can say this straight, right? There is no way in hell. Hell will have to freeze over, and then we may get there, but hell will have to freeze over before there are going to be any transfers of technology on the part of this administration to China or India or other countries, right? At least on a voluntary level. So we already have at least a fundamental break with the current structure of the climate change regime, that this is one of the areas that is fundamental to the bargain there that this administration will not meet. Right? They will refuse to meet it as a matter of policy, as a matter of whatever principle they hold here. The other thing that we need to consider is that on the trade side, right, the WTO provides significantly strong enforcement mechanisms for the protection of intellectual property. And the Trump administration is very clear that its view is that China and other countries are stealing the US intellectual property. Right? They call it IP theft, which if you talk to most IP lawyers, sends them crazy because it's not theft, it's misappropriation or infringement. But right, in that sense, there is a framing here that whatever intellectual property protection exists at the WTO needs to be strengthened, and in bilateral and regional agreements, they need even more protection. And so you're seeing, I think, and are going to see a stronger push by this administration for higher protection of patents and of trade secrets in particular in bilateral and regional free trade agreements that they're going to be negotiating with other countries. What does that mean then for the future of technology here? I think we're going to see probably more disputes at the WTO related to IP, potentially brought by the US against other countries. And part of the reason is that many of these countries, given the fact that the US is going to fail to meet obligations on technology transfer and financing, are going to find themselves looking to take unilateral action to encourage technology transfer. And in doing so, will begin to skirt very close to violation of the rules of the WTO and investment agreements. And given how aggressive about enforcing the rights the Trump administration plans to be, I think we're likely to see more disputes, especially around green technology, arise, at least over the next 4 years. I think there is a middle way, but it will require not so much the U.S.'s cooperation, but the cooperation of countries like the EU and like Japan and Australia in creating separate markets that would be more available and more friendly to the movement of technology between developing countries and developed countries to achieve climate goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker this evening is Ben Beachy. He's a senior policy advisor with the Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program. He investigates the implications of U.S. trade policy for environmental protections, including efforts to combat climate change. Mr. Beachy was previously research director at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, a Nicaragua-based policy analyst and D.C.-based national organizer for Witness for Peace. He's also worked as a visiting research fellow with the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts University and as an investment analyst for the TELUS Institute. Yeah.
Thanks. Let's see if I can figure out how to get the
Okay.
yes.
Let's hit this again. And
Let's go to
that doesn't do it.
no, I can do this.
Okay.
Go back to source. Was that a laptop or is it
PC. Try PC. Select source. There.
No,
Is that
that's
it?
hers.
That's hers. Sorry about that.
No, that's just gonna keep going.
Okay.
We lost our person, right?
Okay. Can you start talking and I'll try to find them?
1 second.
See if I can.
Okay.
You keep on doing it.
Bear with us 1 moment.
Sorry about that.
I think maybe. There we go. Okay.
Oh, there it is. Yep.
Bang. All right, we're on. Hi, how's everyone doing? Still with us. All right, cool. We got it covered. Hi, my name's Ben. I work with the Sierra Club, and Sierra Club has we're the largest grassroots environmental organization in the U.S. Got 2.7 million members. We've been involved in trade for about 2 decades, which is when trade started getting involved in us. We've been around for about 125 years, didn't need to think about trade, preferred not to think about trade, then all of a sudden trade decided to get into things like climate change, while not even saying the words climate change. What do I mean by that? I mean that our trade deals, unfortunately, even though they have not said climate change, have had pretty significant impacts on our climate, starting in the early 90s. So Sierra Club has been one of these groups that's been in the fight for a new trade model and against the old trade model, which we see as an unfair one that has harmed communities, undermined environmental protection, eliminated jobs, increased air and water pollution, and fueled climate change. They have, in short, increased the power and profit of multinational corporations, but often at the expense of the rest of us. And we see the TPP as a pretty clear example of this old model. We would be on the divide, as you laid out, that this was a deal of the old model, not of the new model that we need to see, that actually aligns our trade deals with our climate priorities that many of us share. The TPP, was brought down by an international movement of millions who organized against this deal for years. And it was across party lines, across issue areas, and it's because of that broad opposition that at no point did the TPP ever have a majority in the House to be passed. And then, of course, the TPP was continually raised during the election cycle, and as a result of all that, it met its demise. The question really now is, the TPP model of trade, which we would say is generally a model that is by and for corporations, has maybe not been, is not dead perhaps, but has been fatally wounded, or if not dramatically wounded. So the question in our mind is, what comes next? And I think we have 2 pretty distinct answers to that question today. One model that we would support alongside many different groups across the United States and other trade partner countries is one that is rooted in putting the needs of people and planet first. We would say, we would be in favor of a trade model that fights inequality, and that empowers workers, that supports family farmers and safe and sustainable food, that's premised on the notion that affordable health care is more important than the profit margins of pharmaceutical companies, and more importantly for this conversation today, the premise on the notion that we're at least 2 decades late in bringing our trade deals into alignment with our broadly shared climate priorities, and it's time we bring those two into alignment. We do not need to be giving any more power to the likes of ExxonMobil to be attacking our climate policies, as our status quo trade model has done. Critically, all of this prioritization of human needs over corporate greed doesn't really stop at our borders. We're not in favor of TPP deals because they exacerbate a climate crisis that is wrecking communities and ecosystems all across the world, not just here in the United States, clearly. And beyond climate, we believe that workers everywhere should be paid living wages, not just in the United States. We believe that affordable medicine is something that should be a priority the world over. That's our vision. In short, it's not about prioritizing U.S. interests over those of other countries. It's about prioritizing the needs of people and planet over the narrow interests of multinational corporations. There's an alternative vision out there. You might have heard of it. It's coming from Donald Trump. I'm not going to go into the details because, frankly, there aren't any. So your guess is as good as mine. But we've got little snippets of what we can guess might be Trump's vision for trade. He's saying, yeah, I'm not for multinational capital owning the reins. Instead, he seems to be for some sort of U.S. capital owning the reins, some sort of U.S. first trade model, as he puts it. What does that mean for workers? Well, he's made overtures to saying he's going to help bring back jobs for workers. But this is the guy who has, explicitly said that companies should move to states that don't have strong union protections. The guy who nominated as Secretary of Labor someone who doesn't believe in elevating the minimum wage. The guy who has been content to call out union leaders by name, resulting in them getting death threats. I don't think that this is the man who's going to turn from harping on unions to becoming a champion for workers' rights. On ag, you could say something similar. He's been friendly to big ag, but not really family farmers. Similarly with pharmaceutical companies versus access to medicines. And critically on climate, I think this is where you see the biggest, starkest difference between the vision of trade that we would support and that Trump is endorsing. He's the only world leader, including those from Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries, that does not believe in climate change science, according to some of his statements. It depends on which one you want to look at. He has explicitly said he wants to use trade policy to increase reliance on fossil fuels. In short, we really cannot be expecting Trump to be delivering the climate-friendly trade model we're all hoping for. I would agree with what you said. The chances are approximate to hell freezing over. Furthermore, another big distinction is that, Trump's trade is, insofar as he promotes anyone's interests, it's only the U.S.'s interests versus those of everyone else in the world. He's shown little concern for workers the world over, and he's explicitly stated that his trade policy should finance his anti-immigrant wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. So Trump's vision of trade is steeped in the same xenophobia that guided his campaign. So, given these two pretty diametrically opposed visions of trade that could replace that could fill the policy void left by the TPP, what are we to do? Now, I'm not under any illusion that these two are playing on a level playing field right now. One of them happens to be in the White House. It's not ours. And so, what are we to do during the intervening 4 years where our vision of trade is perhaps popular, and polls would show that, but is not actually in power? One idea would be you could try to find common ground with Trump, but that's not really an option, at least when it comes to making our trade agreements more climate friendly. And as I mentioned, he's made very clear that's not his intent. Even if it were an option, would you really want to do that? Do you really want to be giving Trump more political capital to carry out his various other xenophobic and nefarious projects? We at the Sierra Club do not, so we're not interested in partnering with Trump on trade. What then are we to do? We believe that it's important that we instead assert our vision for what a trade model looks like very clearly and concretely, that we build support for that vision by doing deep dive grassroots engagement and partnership building across the wide array of groups that would be interested in a new trade model, including one that is more friendly to our climate objectives. And in the end, there's reason to believe that Trump's vision for trade will actually fail, that he won't deliver the goods. He won't be bringing all those manufacturing jobs back or the coal jobs back to West Virginia, where I'm from. And so then the question is, if it does not prevail, it's incumbent on us to have make sure that our alternative vision is ready when his vision and hopefully his administration are no longer here. So to assert our vision, which I said was the first step, we have started as an initial step, and it's certainly not a last one, of producing an alternative model of trade. That is a climate-friendly model. That turns the current trade rules on their heads so that trade would be an instrument for advancing our climate priorities rather than the opposite. One of the clear Trump trade initiatives is going to be a negotiation of NAFTA, as was mentioned. And so we have to assert our vision here. What should a climate-friendly NAFTA negotiation, what would it look like? Our basis for evaluating any NAFTA negotiation is clear. It's does it support rather than undermine a more stable climate, clean air and water, healthy communities, and good jobs? If it does, great. Don't, again, hell freezing over is probably the mantra. So if it does not, we will work with our partners to make sure it meets the same fate as the TPP. What it specifically we would like to see in NAFTA, a few quick points to close. It was mentioned the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. That's been one of the most controversial elements of our trade agreements. These are a big threat, not just to the concept of democracy, but to our climate objectives. It's empowered, NAFTA specifically has empowered corporations like ExxonMobil, TransCanada, to go around our courts, go to these private tribunals of 3 lawyers, most of them corporate lawyers, and sue our governments. What are they suing over? Well, under NAFTA alone, corporations like this have sued over bans on toxic chemicals. They sued on a moratorium on fracking in Canada. They've sued on, as you mentioned, the Bilcon case, the rejections of mining in Canada, and they sued us for the rejection of the Trans-Canada pipeline. They've extracted more than $370 million from our governments thus far, and pending claims total more than $50 billion. What would we do with this whole system? Chuck it. It's a pretty simple solution. We have a more complex one, but we don't have time to discuss it now. If you want to talk about it in Q&A, go for it. But in essence, we don't see any need for this, so done. Next major concern with NAFTA is that there's an energy chapter in NAFTA that is really built on a fossil fuel economy and not built on a clean energy economy. In short, it says that it really limits Canada's ability to restrict the production of fossil fuels such as tar sands oil, which is one of the most, if not the most, climate polluting fossil fuel in the world. There are other rules in there, which we don't have time to go into, but that threaten renewable portfolio standards and other tools that we use to regulate energy. So what would we do? Well, we would eliminate the energy chapter, we would narrow the offending rules, and we would create a carve-out, a broad carve-out that essentially exempts climate policies from a host of trade rules that can be used to challenge climate policies. In essence, they would say, if there's a conflict between these old trade rules and climate objectives, the climate objectives win. It's also important, though, to recognize that the threats to climate policies from our current trade model don't just come from those climate policies being challenged in trade tribunals. They also come from the fact that our trade deals make it easy for corporations to traverse international borders and simply offshore production so as to skirt our climate policies. The way you get around that is by inserting binding requirements into the trade deals themselves. That's what we've done with labor. As was mentioned, that's what we've already done with MEAs, with multilateral environmental agreements. We have not yet done with climate commitments. And so we would ask that happen. In NAFTA, specifically, that each country be required to adopt, maintain, and implement policies to comply with international environmental agreements that include the Paris Climate Agreement. So basically, we would say, let's make NAFTA congruent with Paris. Let's also eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. They distort trade and contribute to climate change. And we're going to make all of these new obligations enforceable to a new dispute settlement mechanism. Problem with the existing one is it has yet to work. And it's been around for about 25 years. There's not a single case being brought against a single U.S. trade partner under a single U.S. trade pact over the violations of environmental provisions in trade agreements, despite widely documented evidence that those violations are indeed happening. We need a new model, and we have some ideas there. And to close up, we would also, one more quick thing on this, that you can, it's actually a more direct way of ensuring that you don't have a race to the bottom in climate standards, is by having a border adjustment tax, as was mentioned, or a carbon duty. So that would basically say, it would make it very difficult to simply offshore jobs and production overseas, so as to skip out and avert climate policies, because you would be charged a tax at the border for getting those goods back into the country. That would help prevent job offshoring and carbon leakage. It would also create a powerful incentive for other countries, other trade partner countries, to increase their climate action so as to have better access to markets around the world. We would also say flip on the fact that NAFTA makes it more difficult to do green procurement on its head, so as to actually require green procurement by countries. And then all of what we've talked about before are threats to climate policies that actually aren't about trade, because it turns out most of our trade deals aren't about trade. They're a package of laws sold under the guise of trade, but there is some bit that is trade. Of course, under NAFTA is more trucking. Trucking means more emissions. What are you going to do about that? We have some ideas. One would be to make the market access to make tariff reductions for the goods on a given truck, contingent on that truck meeting design efficiency standards, which would mean it would be lower emissions. Which would be a self-enforcing initiative. So all of this is part of, again, a broader need to transform trade. NAFTA negotiation might just be one of the first steps. We really don't have any time to spare. The seas are rising. Droughts and floods are getting more severe. It's really incumbent on us. We don't have another decade to wait to bring our trade deals into conformity with our climate obligations. And with that, I look forward to discussing.
Thank you very much for three very interesting presentations. I'd like to start by putting a question to the panel, which is that if the U.S. does drop out of Paris in one form or another and doesn't move forward with climate controls, but some other countries do, how vulnerable do you think the U.S. would be to border taxes imposed by those other countries? Because there's been some talk about that.
Well, I mean, border taxes can be used for two reasons. Is this on? Okay. I mean, border taxes, can you hear me? Can be used as a domestic measure. Border taxes can be used as a domestic measure just to deal with the issue of leakages. And for example, Canada, there are academics in Canada who are suggesting Canada use border taxes not so much as a punitive measure, but just to make sure that if we put on a carbon tax, that others, that we don't have to bring in imports that have a lower carbon footprint. But there's also that aspect of imposing it on parties that are not adhering to climate goals. It has been discussed. I think shortly after the news of the Trump election became known, which was, I was at Marrakesh at COP22, where the first reaction was a stunned silence. But then there were, I think it was France who said, well, look, if you guys aren't going to play, we're going to put border taxes on for that. Now, it's not exactly clear what that would cover. The other point, though, is that the U.S. is a big economy. So though you do a lot of trade, so I don't know how much others could affect this and whether how many other countries would have to be involved in imposing this kind of tax for it to be effective. There's also concerns raised when that topic first came up that, many countries didn't want to start a trade war with the U.S. And so that's where I think the discussions are right now.
All right, is this on? All right. I think there's kind of two ways you can answer that question. And one, it's kind of a political question, and then there's the other side, which is just the straight legal or policy question. The political question is like, so France said, yeah, we might do that. I think, you're just playing a game of geopolitics there. Like if France imposes a border adjustment, certainly there'll be some sort of retaliation, I would guess, from the United States. Not in kind, it wouldn't be a border adjustment tax, but it might be something else. Will France want to play that game? I'd be surprised, but maybe. Who knows? I think an interesting question is on the policy front. Would you be able to impose a carbon duty on imports coming from the United States? It depends on how you structure the thing. If you structure it as basically, do you have climate policies that are good? And namely, do you have a carbon price or not? Well, then we don't. We don't have one. If you structure it instead on what is the carbon intensity of your goods production for each class of goods, there we actually have a lower carbon intensity than many countries, though not all. And so the EU, certain EU countries certainly would have an advantage there. So I would say it depends a little bit on for the policy question on how they would structure it. I think we're probably a ways off from any of this being more than hypothetical, though, at this point. I think there'll be a lot of bluster around carbon tax before we see any actual imposition thereof.
So the initial... Am I good? Well, what the hell?
Yeah, that worked.
Okay, hi. So the initial concern related to border tax adjustments from developing countries was that those would be used against them, right? Now that it looks like it might be something to be able to use against the U.S., I think there might be more openness to how that would be structured. The limitation is that it would have to be multilateral, and it would have to be dependent on an agreement group and an outside agreement group. I think that's really the only way that developing countries would ever feel safe about allowing or enabling the use of a border tax adjustment in that context. Otherwise, I think you get no agreement, and that, along with other countries, developing countries would very much participate in any case that was brought against any other country that imposed a border tax adjustment, because they know that it would be used against them. If used against the U.S., it would also be used against them.
Another question. Do you think that trade should affirmatively be used as an instrument of climate policy, or is it just that if we have trade agreements, we should try to make them as climate or environmentally benign as possible? Any of you have a view on that?
That's an interesting question, because that was a topic that we discussed today when we had discussions on this. I think there's a variety of views, and one of the views would be that let's make sure that there are not trade rules that impede the implementation of appropriate climate measures by states. Then the next step would be, do you want trade rules to be imposing additional climate rules? Having worked on the MEA side, I hesitate to transfer that rulemaking function from the MEAs that actually deal with those substantive measures to trade bodies. I mean, currently there are some agreements that recognize MEAs and require, as part of the text of the trade treaty, that the parties respect their existing MEA obligations. I think that's maybe as far as I would be comfortable going in terms of how to advance that. Having said that, there is a problem with enforcement for MEAs. They tend to have they have theoretical dispute resolution mechanisms that are, to my knowledge, never have been used. Then they've substituted a softer version called compliance mechanisms. But these generally don't have the force of law, because they tend to be developed in on a decision basis, which is not legally binding. So I think where you draw the line depends on how you see the role of trade and MEAs. I think the Sierra Club probably draws the line in a different place than I'd draw it. And there you go.
So I've been more or less of the position that trade and climate change are inextricably linked. And so by default, the trade regime has dealt with climate whether or not we wanted the regime to do so. And I share with many academics the sense that this is not just a problem of the trade and climate regime, it's a problem characteristic of the broader system of international law as we've increased in globalization and increased in the number of venues and number of international treaties. And so this is a subset of the broader problem of international fragmentation that I think we need to address. And so at least one of the solutions that I think we can draw from work that was done by the International Law Commission and others is that there has been a failure of comity at the international level that is particularly reflected in the trade and climate arena. The climate change negotiations, when you look at the convention, has a very specific clause about what the interaction should be with the trade regime, right? So I think one of the things to think about is there can be reciprocity there, which is when, not necessarily negotiating new rules in the mechanism, but when panels and the appellate body take up things that have an overlap with climate, right, or any other multilateral environmental regime, that needs to be applicable law that is used in the interpretation of WTO obligations. In the same way that the Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties is applicable law that guides the interpretation of obligations in the WTO, that should be the same for other multilateral environmental agreements, and not just in a narrow sense of Article 20, though that is where it's been most effective, the Article 20 exception in the GATT, but more broadly whenever we are looking at what is the scope of the obligation and how to interact with a reasonable, plausible, rational environmental or climate measure, and whether it should be invalidated. I think that's one of the areas, and that's a decision that wasn't necessarily made by the rulemakers. That's a decision that was made by the appellate body in thinking about what the interpretive approach should be. And I think that's something that can be slowly transformed over time.
So yeah, should you insert affirmative climate commitments into trade agreements, or should trade agreements just merely be made benign to climate? Yes, I think is the answer. I think you can't do one without the other. I don't think trade agreements are benign unless they have climate commitments in there. And that is for the same reason that we have labor commitments in there, that we have other environmental commitments in there. If you are setting up a trade agreement, you are trying to lower barriers to trade. You're trying to make it easier for corporations and firms to be able to traverse borders looking for the lowest costs. If one of those costs is compliance with climate policies, which it is, then you have just created an incentive for that firm to evade that policy, go abroad, and thereby undercut the policy. It doesn't matter where carbon is spewed. It still goes to the same atmosphere, still has the same impact on climate change. And so you have effectively not just like undercut in some like theoretical sense, you have literally undercut the utility of the policy in country A by allowing the company to move to country B. So I don't think you can actually have a climate benign trade agreement unless you put affirmative climate commitments in there so as to prevent that simple evasion of domestic climate policies. That means doing things like putting the Paris climate commitment in there. It means eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and a host of other things so that you have a base floor of climate protection. It's the same logic we use for believing that we shouldn't allow companies to traverse borders looking for employment of child labor, because we think that to have child labor in country B will undercut workers in country A. It's the same principle I'm suggesting for climate. So these are not two separate things. To have a benign agreement requires having affirmative climate commitments.
Questions? Steve.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. I have a different kind of question about trade and climate change. It relates to adaptation, and it relates to the financing of adaptation. No one knows how adaptation programs, which are talked about in the Paris Agreement, are going to be financed. There's going to be a need for a great deal of money to do that from the developed countries, which have no interest at the moment in providing that money. The New York City Bar Association last year proposed an international financial transaction tax to go into a dedicated fund to be used by developing countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change, independent of reduction and greenhouse gas reduction obligations under Paris. Do you think that the reset in multilateral trade agreements, whether it's the new version of TPP or NAFTA or a trade agreement with the EU or just the UK, might conceivably provide for such an international financial transaction tax, which would not, after all, go to manufacturing of goods, but the transfer of funds across borders, which candidate Trump did actually complain about?
Well, I'll take a crack at that because it's certainly out of the range of the things I usually think about, but I think it's very innovative proposal. I think that there could be a transaction tax. I'm not sure that the UNFCCC would be the place to do it. I think there would be financial organizations or agreements that might be the place to do it, but in terms of funds that are available for adaptation financing, the Green Climate Fund is supposed to be 50% for adaptation financing, and I think it can receive funds from various sources. So it's possible that that kind of tax could be funneled into the Green Climate Fund as part of the need for adaptation financing. That's not something I know for sure, but it's certainly something that could be explored. So there is some room for that.
So I think there are questions about the mechanism by which the IFT would be implemented. So the core demand for the Adaptation Fund and for the Green Climate Fund is that we have predictable, directly accessible funds. The IFT could be implemented essentially at the national level as a way for countries themselves to generate finances without necessarily raising taxes or directly from the fiscus. They can just generate the tax and then transfer it into the GCF and the Adaptation Fund. So that's I think the simpler option that I think a lot of people are seeing, is that recommending the adoption of an IFT by countries as a way for them to find a politically palatable way to raise the money that isn't directly sort of tax related or fundraising or spending related in the traditional sense. There are countries for whom that's a problem, so the UK and others, where that's where the firms would be affected, but that's also where the money is. So I think the other option is to say, let's agree this in some international mechanism, right? And then the question is where, right? Where do we see there being a venue where you could indeed dip into the stream in a way at the international level that would be separate from the national implementations? But I think that's a much more complex question. There's been an argument about using special drawing rights out of the IMF as a way to generate those. That's, I think, more complicated than almost even the IMF is willing to deal with. And it's difficult to locate another venue other than the national governments to do that. UNFCCC wants nothing to do with managing an IFT because they have neither the expertise nor the political mandate to do so. And that, I think, leaves us in a difficult position, which is that we're still stuck with the sense that it's national contributions, right, that are measured and addressed through, whatever MRV transparency mechanism we want for their contributions at GCF, and that's how they're measured. Any mechanism that doesn't address and measure those national contributions, I think, makes it difficult for other countries to say, okay, we can take credit for X amount of money. We can take credit for X amount of money that's been put into the system. So I think whatever solution we have, we're stuck with a national IFT. And for that, then the countries are going to resist any actual international obligation to do so. But there's nothing preventing them from doing so on their own.
On the question of whether or not you would want to use financial transaction tax to fund climate finance or adaptation or otherwise, I would leave that one to the climate finance experts as to the best sources of funding. I'm somewhat agnostic to that. It should be dependable, should be sizable, etc. But I think on its merits, a financial transaction tax makes sense regardless of what you do with the funds. To dampen the vicissitudes of price swings created by short-term trading that leads to instability in the market, I think it makes sense to have a financial transaction tax. Also, it just gets a large amount of revenue. It could be used for some good. On the question of whether or not the best way to implement a financial transaction tax is via a trade agreement or through a unilateral administration by a country like the U.S., I'm also pretty agnostic on that. I would just flag that if you're going to try to stick a financial transaction tax into a trade agreement, you're going to need to deal with some existing trade rules that would say you shouldn't do that. There's transfers provisions that say you shouldn't be slowing down transfer of capital between countries. So you're going to have to deal with those. That's, again, an old part of the old trade model that would have to be reformed.
I'm sitting here with actually a lot of concerns about basically everything, right? Because we're living in a world today where there's a lot of major issues affecting everyone. Okay, today we're talking about climate change, geopolitics, energy. We're talking about technology advancements. We're talking about IP, all these things. So there's two versions of the world that we like to live in, right? There's an ideal version, and there's reality. So in the ideal world, right, every country is going to convert today to the use of renewable energy, right? Clean technology, clean energy, right? Everybody is going to be just all for it. Give up everything you're using today, and you convert to solar, wind, hydro, anything, right? It's not going to happen quickly. It will take a long time for that conversion process to come around, right? In the ideal world, everybody's mind is focused on this, all day long. We've got treaties, we've got principles, we've got, policies that stick only to this. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And, it's going to take a long time. But in the real world, we live in a world today where, the world is consuming about 35 billion barrels of oil every year. So if you're going to put that into perspective, right? We're actually going to run out of oil pretty soon. We're looking at 50 to 100 years, right? So there comes to a time where we all have to wake up and say, look, we have to have a global standard. We have to have a global benchmark for what we can do to come together to fix this whole energy situation. Because as the world demands more of the energy, as the world becomes hungry of energy, right? What's going to happen is that the companies, the corporations, are going to be more aggressive at actually producing it. And this process is going to create irreparable harm to the environment, right? Very, very damaging process to the environment. So, my biggest concern here is when is everyone going to wake up? Right? I mean, it's really tough to get 200 countries leaders to come together and really try to address this. I mean, we talk about all these subjects, but we're just a very tiny pocket in the universe. Okay? So how is that ever going to be possible to implement something before it becomes too late?
Thank you. Do any of you want to respond to that?
So I like to call myself a pragmatist about international negotiations and finding consensus on this, right? And one has to understand the incremental nature of progress in creating international consensus around these things. So let's take our trade consensus, right? It started out with a huge ambition in 1947, which collapsed, right? And then over the years, with relatively sort of progressive movements and the increased independence of countries, right? You ended up with, again, I'm not saying this was a great thing, but you ended up at some point with the Washington Consensus, the development of the WTO, right? The current phase of globalization that we're in that has been, let's be clear, hugely successful at lifting millions of people out of poverty, right? And so the question we have to remember is that That was not an overnight process. That took years and years of negotiations, of venue shifting, of form shifting, failures of some countries that needed to fail, so we had demonstration effects for what was a bad policy to follow, right? The creation and the opening up of countries like China, Brazil, and others to different economic approaches. Now, what that has meant, of course, is that we suddenly realize that all that development implies we have a climate problem, right? So now we need to figure out how to deal with that, and that is also going to take time. And the timelines for that, the IPCC has told us, are long, but also that we need to begin to take action yesterday, right? There are still pathways open, right? There are still pathways open to solving the problem. We have a problem in that politicians and firms have applied, discount rates to current action versus future action. But I don't think we should characterize this as something that is inconceivable or idealistic or incapable of being achieved. What we have to think about is, what are the incremental steps that we need to get us there, right? We don't need everybody on board. We just need our critical mass of the right set of actors on board, right? We don't.
We have a leadership problem right now where, this country for the next 4 years is really going to take a step back in energy, climate adoption in space. Right?
So I think we need to move on to other people.
But just notice what China has just done, right? Which is that they've moved.
I wish that China's One Belt One Road policy has a climate trade policy built into it. That would be really ideal, right? Because that would,
Okay,
yeah, just my opinion.
thank you. I will, but first,
I was quite intrigued by the concept of doing a reset on trade policy, having come through the system when it was more corporate driven, completely, I'd say. And I also listened to a lot of the comments about whether climate change, for example, should be incorporated as part of trade agreements or side agreements related to the environment. And I would say that unlike other environmental issues, which were more amenable to side agreements because they may have had an impact on economic issues, but they were more discrete. It seems to me that in order to resolve climate issues at all, it's going to have to be incorporated into economic agreements, because unlike other stuff, it's all about economics, it's all about energy, and every aspect of it is economic. So I would just wonder if any of you have some comments, for example, on how this might be done in the context of trade and services agreement, and particularly trade and energy services, because as it stands, that is primarily driven by corporate interests and, access to other markets. And I'm wondering how you might envision, incorporating climate-related issues into that type of agreement.
Sure, I can take that. So, well, I would say first, let's hope there is no trade and services agreement. Right now, the thing is in limbo, and we'd like it to stay that way, with respect to the Sierra Club at least. The trade and services agreement is placing a lot of the same rules we've seen in other arenas on services. And while we have other services agreements under the WTO, this would be the first one, if leaked proposals are true, that the U.S. would be committing its energy sector writ large to these rules. What do these rules say? One of them says you should not have any policies that would place an outright restriction on the number of service suppliers or the size of service suppliers. Well, what's an outright restriction on the number of service suppliers when it comes to, like, fracking, say? You have countries like France, states like New York banning fracking, which we stand behind because we think it's, fracking has got clear proven detriment to air and water, in addition to the climate impacts. But to ban fracking would be to reduce the number of fracking suppliers to 0, which would contradict the rule that has been proposed for the trade and services agreement, meaning you could be challenged for a ban on fracking under the services agreement. There are other rules in there that are problematic as well, but that's probably one of the clearer examples of how this agreement is built on the old model, in which it assumes that somehow trade and climate are not one and the same. How we can somehow have trade agreements that ensure seamless borders, no obstacles to the flow of fossil fuel investment without implicating the climate somehow. I don't see that as a tenable proposition. It's not one. And so I think we need to start from scratch. If we want to have a services agreement, that's great. Let's talk about how we incentivize an increase in renewable energy services. But let us not have pretend like we can cast a blind eye to the climate impacts of saying we were going to eliminate all restrictions on all services everywhere.
There's a microphone. Microphone.
You probably answered half my question, but what I really want to get at is, yes, we defeated TPP, but it's hard for me to imagine that when TISA comes down the pipe, which is what you're referring to, that will not go, it's 10 times bigger than TPP, much worse than TPP, from almost any point of view. But it's hard for me to imagine that Trump does not get turned around by all the pro-TPP people around him, that TISA will not be will be a fact, and that it is a fact that needs to be dealt with today. And so I'm just wondering if that's something that you want to think about.
I appreciate your sense of urgency, and I would share it. Look, I have no faith in this administration. I'm just going to put a period at the end of that sentence. I don't need to qualify it further. And that includes on TISA. I don't believe that while, as I mentioned, Trump has said things about needing a new trade model. He claims credit for the death of the TPP. That he is going to somehow replace it with a trade model that goes against the fossil fuel interests that he stacked his cabinet with. I don't think that's a likely scenario. I think a more likely scenario is that yes, they would be happy to support TISA, but we don't know. We don't know. Politically, they might see it as disadvantageous for the optics. Who knows? If and when they do take TISA forward, if they have a first round of negotiations of TISA under this administration, you can better believe that we and many other organizations, yes, will be calling them out for their hypocrisy, saying you claim to say you're going to stand for a new trade model, regardless of the contents of that model. This isn't even about the contents. This is simply not a new model. This is a trade deal that has been largely negotiated and to a pretty full extent by a previous administration under the old status quo trade model. How can you claim to represent change in trade policy rather than more of the same corporate model when you're just basically picking up where the last model left off? So yes, I agree. It needs to be called out. Not many people understand the trade and services agreement, and we're looking at if the administration would move forward on TISA, we would move forward in making a bigger public stir about it.
Regarding how this COP22 regulation will impact the ISO 14001 standards in corporates that has been spoken about so many years ago in regards of environmental management. Thank you.
Could you clarify which ISO standard you're referring to?
The standards for environment 14001.
I don't have my ISO code in front of me, so I'm not sure which particular standard for the environment you're referring to.
Well, it has been established many years ago in order to bring quality to the environment through the corporate perspective. Now, how could this help within the NDC's context of action?
So you're not asking about the trade aspect of this. You're saying within COP22, within the NDCs themselves, not a trade agreement ability to shoehorn in the ISO standards.
In and how far it could impact the trade agreement indirectly as well.
So on trade, so like ISO standards have been long. There's been a quest to harmonize ISO standards in trade agreements. I haven't heard that I haven't heard of any real proposals on the table in any pending trade negotiations for that particular standard to be harmonized. By harmonization, they mean to pick one standard that applies broadly across all the different signatory countries to a trade agreement. I think harmonization is it's rarely been used to the advantage of, it's rarely been used in a way that means compliance up, where the country that has the lower standard complies up to the higher standard. Typically, it's meant compliance down. That you have two different standards of regulation, and by harmonizing, you bring the higher one down. So I'd be suspicious of inserting an ISO standard into a trade agreement if it was going to be subject to the terms of harmonization, which is, again, typically meant a comply down result. So I have not yet heard of a concrete proposal to insert it into a trade agreement. So I would have to hear that before opining directly.
I was just going to mention that in the climate change discourse, that hasn't been a big part of it, but I think there is an increasing awareness of the role of standards more generally as sort of an aspect of soft law to advance environmental objectives.
So we are out of time. I want to thank our speakers for a very interesting discussion, and I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. Thank you.